Welcome to the Mid-Manhattan Library, the largest circulating branch of the New York Public Library. Through the access that we provide through the digital and print collections, also producing programs and hosting programs like this evening's author talk, and the many outreach services that we provide to you, our patrons, the library continues the mission of inspiring lifelong learning, advancing knowledge, and strengthening our communities, and we thank you very much for your continued support. Many years ago, Woody Guthrie said, "There are several ways of saying what's on your mind." And in states and counties where it ain't too healthy to talk too loud, speak your mind, or even vote like you want to, folks have found either other ways of getting the word out around here. One of the mainest ways is by singing. Huddie Ledbelly, Irene Goodnight, Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land, Bob Dylan, Maggie's Farm, Peter, Paul and Mary, If I Had a Hammer, Puff the Magic Dragon, and Odetta, the Queen of the Civil Rights Movement. Who can recall these memorable artists and the songs that they wrote? Folk City, New York, and the American Folk Revival, published to accompany the exhibition of the same name, was presented at the Museum of the City of New York from June 17, 2015, through its extended closing in January of this year. It's both a popular and scholarly work that traces the origins of the urban post-war revival of folk music back to the 1920s. Weaved into this beautifully illustrated book are rare photographs and recollections by artists, publishers, composers, songwriters, managers, and record producers. Folk City explores how New York City, specifically Greenwich Village, was the epicenter of the folk music revival between 1950 and 1965. Stephen Petrus, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is an Andrew W. Mellon Research Fellow at the New York Historical Society, where he's currently working on his second book, A Political and Cultural History of Greenwich Village in the 1960s. He recently completed a Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellowship at the Museum of the City of New York, where he curated the exhibition, Folk City, New York, and the American Folk Music Revival, an examination of New York's central role in fueling the mid-20th century folk music revival. He co-authored the book with Ronald D. Cohen, folk music historian and Emeritus Professor of History at Indiana University Northwest. Mr. Petrus has published essays on 20th century U.S. urban and cultural history. He received his PhD in history from the City University of New York, CUNY Graduate Center, and has taught at Lehman College in the Bronx. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our author tonight, Mr. Petrus.
Thank you so much, Allison, for that very generous introduction. I also want to thank Debbie Hirsch for helping to arrange this talk tonight. I'm so delighted to be here, honored to be here, really, in large part because I did so much of my research at the New York Public Library for Folk City, so it's particularly special for this reason. And it's great to see everybody. Thank you for coming out on this wintry night. And yes, I want to give an overview of the book, and as Allison said, of course, it accompanied the exhibition that closed recently, and you know, the book lives on, so really happy about that. It's been well received, and again, great to see you. And both the book and the exhibition really focused on the period from 1958 to 1965. This was the commercial boom of the folk revival, and New York was at the center of it. And the book and the exhibition asked the question, why New York? Why did New York become the focal point of this nationwide revival of interest in folk music? And thank you. As Allison said, I do trace the roots of the revival back to the 20s and the 30s, you know, looking at important cultural, political, and economic developments. And you know, as I was doing research for the book and the exhibition, it just really struck me, what a fascinating question. I thought it was almost a paradox that folk music, largely traditional and rural in background, flourished in this urban and modern milieu of New York City. And I just thought, wow, that's almost seems like a contradiction, but the more I researched, the more I found that, in fact, it wasn't that much of a surprise. And I portray New York as really a center of production, where record producers were here, club owners, radio show hosts, influential managers, agents, journalists, editors writing about folk music, all of this kind of commercial infrastructure here to attract folk musicians from all over the country. And there was indeed an influx of folk singers to the city, especially in the 1930s and the 1960s. So I do emphasize these particular periods. And I also, and I want to develop this point, talk about the progressive political milieu in the city that also was a lure to many folk singers. So just a very brief overview. And going back to the 1920s, the roots of the revival, the 1920s and 1930s, important in the book, and I really focus on this at the beginning, because we have folklorists who are traveling the country, very much interested in recording traditional songs, in collecting traditional songs, going to different regions of the country. There was a sense of urgency too. This notion that the country is becoming more and more urban, increasingly industrial, rural culture is in decline. These folk songs are, in some cases becoming extinct. So we need to document these songs. We need to publish them in songbooks. We need to record them for posterity. These are part of our cultural heritage. These are part of our identity as Americans. And significant folklorists were doing this. Many of them, prominently was Carl Sandburg, who's probably better known for being a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. He was also a biographer of Abraham Lincoln. He was a passionate collector of traditional songs and again traveled throughout the nation. He often did he was on a national lecture circuit, and on the circuit he met with friends, with labor leaders, with folklorists, and he collected these songs and would publish them in this book, this highly influential book called The American Song Bag in 1927. 280 songs that he collected and published, and published them in a very accessible manner. He was interested in reaching a large readership. It was interesting the way he presented and categorized these songs. He did not categorize, for example, African American songs into a separate section, but presented them as really central to American cultural traditions. So I think, kind of acknowledging the rich contributions of African Americans to American traditional music and American culture in general. This book was wildly successful. It was extensively reviewed. It went through many editions. It was in print for about 70 years. It was published by a press in New York. So, New York is the center of the publishing industry, comes into play here. What's interesting, though, about Sandburg compared to other folklorists later is that he shunned modern recording technology. In his travels, he collected written texts, he transcribed songs, he took down notes of lyrics as he heard people sing. So, in contrast to others, he did not use modern recording technology in his collection, but nevertheless, it reached a wide audience and helped introduce Americans to a vast array of traditional songs. Especially emphasize the significance of father and son folklorists John and Alan Lomax from Texas, who were really on a mission in some ways. They worked for the Library of Congress from 1934 well into the 1940s. They, as preeminent folklorists, again, traveled to relatively isolated areas throughout the country using their modern recording equipment, collecting songs from cotton plantations, from cowboy ranches, lumber camps. They went to penitentiaries. Penitentiaries in particular were important, prisoners singing on a chain gang. They thought, wow, these songs are so rich in content. And also penitentiaries, outside mainstream culture, they believed that songs were particularly pure. That is, they hadn't been corrupted by the phonograph or the radio, which was becoming prominent in the 1930s. So here we can really capture a treasure trove of music, like as you see convicts singing in South Carolina in 1934. They also, as I say, going to different regions of the country, the Texas Hill Country, Mississippi Delta, Piedmont region of North Carolina, the Great Lakes region, New England, the Western Plains, and expanding, I think, our understanding of American culture, that all of these regions had customs, music that are a part of American heritage. And I think they're going away from earlier academic folklorists like Cecil Sharp, who really focused on collecting Anglo-Saxon Appalachian ballads from Appalachia, but they're saying, no, we have to kind of expand our lens. So that's why I write preserving and expanding the nation's cultural heritage. Again, using state-of-the-art phonograph, disc recordings, a disc recorder that weighed in at about 315 pounds. It was the latest and most modern recording equipment at the time. So I think of them as like anthropologists doing field work, concerned that these songs are becoming extinct, that we need to preserve them. These songs have been transmitted orally from generation to generation, going back to the 19th century, to the 18th century. And again, just like Carl Sandburg, they were really keen and eager to illuminate the range of African American traditions. And all told, they would record and publish about 10,000 songs in the 30s and 40s. And many of these songs would become source material for the revival when it really flourished in the late 1950s, when there was a nationwide boom. Younger folk singers were turning to the Library of Congress field recordings, inspired by a lot of the Lomax field recordings. And also, again, to show the multi-ethnic heritage, as I display a picture of Mexican girls singing in San Antonio. In other words, this is part of who we are, a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. In the process, they're really challenging the idea of this capital C culture, that culture isn't just something we should associate with the symphonic orchestra, with fine arts, with classical music, but again, people singing while they're working or while they're on the chain gang. So, again, important anthropologists in this regard. So the 30s and the early 40s, we see, as I suggested in the introduction, an influx of folk singers to New York City, and many of them, of course, and Allison in her introduction alluded to Woody Guthrie, the Dust Bowl troubadour, native of Okama, Oklahoma. He also grew up partly in Pampa, Texas. He arrived in New York in 1940. He had been in California, and like many people in Texas, in this region, he was uprooted, his family was uprooted and displaced by the Dust Bowl, this natural catastrophe in the mid-1930s. He traveled to the West Coast and learned the songs of Okies and Arkies and Texans, became very sympathetic to their plight, empathized with them, documented their hardship in California and the California agricultural sector. Of course, very similar to the novelist John Steinbeck in Grapes of Wrath. Celebrated the dignity of the labor of farmers and workers and spoke out for them when injustice occurred, whether perpetrated by unscrupulous bankers or exploitative bosses. And this was who Woody was. This was his identity. He wrote "This Land Is Your Land" just a couple of blocks from here, actually, right on 43rd Street and 6th Avenue in 1940. Not too long after he arrived in New York, and it was a rebuttal to Kate Smith's version of Irving Berlin's "God Bless America." And Woody heard the song was being played continuously on the radio, and he just said, "This doesn't represent my people. This is not, this is not my people who were uprooted." And so he pays tribute in some way to a more inclusive, democratic, less jingoistic version of America than Irving Berlin, and just penned it a few blocks from here on 43rd Street and 6th Avenue in Hanover House, where he was living at the time. This image, it's a publicity shot from his, for his autobiography called Bound for Glory, which was published in 1943. It was a blend of fact and fiction, so Woody often embellished his own past, and so Bound for Glory, this is a publicity shot. Great picture of him in the New York subway. Another seminal figure, and he's really getting a lot of attention. There was a Leadbelly Fest just last week at Carnegie Hall. There was a tribute to Leadbelly in Kennedy Center last year in a Royal Albert Hall in London, and he was especially featured in the Folk City exhibition. I was able to negotiate the loan for his guitar from the Leadbelly estate in Tennessee. Leadbelly, quote, Hootie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly, discovered by the Lomaxes during their field recording trips in a prison in Louisiana, Angola prison. He'd been was serving time for attempted murder. He had served time earlier for murder. He was released in '34, but prior to that, the Lomaxes encountered him on their trips in 1933 and 1934, and were just astonished at his repertoire. He knew hundreds of songs, blues, spirituals, cowboy songs, traditional ballads, had this commanding performance style and a 12-string guitar. He had this resonant voice, really charismatic, and he's responsible for us knowing many songs like Goodnight Irene, Midnight Special, Rock Island Line. Though he did not write these songs himself, he had learned them on his trips on his, early in the 20th century in the Deep South in Louisiana, Mississippi, and he absorbed them, learned them, had a terrific memory, and would then teach people. So he was sort of a conveyor belt, transmitted these classic songs. Came to New York with John Lomax in early 1935. Lived more or less in New York City until 1949. He was in different places as well, and performed. And folk singers during this period were performing at venues like the Village Vanguard, also associated with jazz, of course, in Greenwich Village, Cafe Society. I think one important point here is that these were interracial venues. So again, they're helping to break down racial barriers, social barriers through their performance. You can see Leadbelly there. And behind him, another great folk singer I'll talk about is Josh White in the back of the picture. So really astonishing. Leadbelly was, again, rather obscure in his own lifetime, but preeminent in the New York folk music community. But again, in retrospect, he's widely celebrated. And as these singers are coming from different parts of the country to New York in the 30s and early 40s, indeed, they're forming these artistic and personal networks. You see here, again, Josh White on the left, Leadbelly in the center, and the young Pete Seeger. Look how young he is there, right? Harvard dropout from a New England patrician family. His father, Charles, was a musicologist, a composer, a real eminent authority on music. Pete came to the city in the late 30s. He wanted to become a journalist, but learned to play the banjo. He, in part, learned to play guitar from Leadbelly. So again, you can kind of get a sense that they're playing together, they're collaborating, they're forming this budding community, they're learning from each other, they represent different traditions. Josh White from South Carolina, again, trading songs. Josh White, helped introduce urban audiences to country blues, to gospel music, to social protest songs. His album, Southern Exposure, Joshua White and his Carolinians, was one of the first civil rights albums in 1941, released by Columbia Records in New York City. So Josh was a real activist, formed a close relationship with the Roosevelts in the 1940s, performed on occasion at the White House, but again, really became obscure. His career was really derailed by the Red Scare in the early 1950s that I'll talk about shortly.
Do you have a year of this photo?
I don't have a year of this photo. It's got to be the early 40s, around 42, 43, I would guess. You can see just how young Pete is at that time. So it's early 40s, circa early 40s. Great picture, right? During the Great Depression, again, I mentioned the importance of the progressive political climate in New York City. We see this connection, increasing connection between folk music and leftist politics. At first, in the early 30s, I think the left in New York, the Communist Party, for example, were reluctant to embrace folk music. Charles Seeger, the musicologist, said something to the effect, well, folk music is passive, it's weak, it's melancholic. This is hardly the kind of music that will lead a socialist revolution. a proletariat revolution of workers trying to overthrow their bosses and transform society. But by the end of the decade, with the advent of the Popular Front in American culture, there was an increasing appreciation for the, quote, common man, a celebration of common folk, their songs, their legends, their myths, their stories. Vernacular culture, indeed, was increasingly appreciated in folk music too. If we mine folk music and explore it, it will help mobilize us and energize us and bring us together. We can become aware of people's concerns, people's hopes, and people's struggles. So the New York left, mostly middle class in background, would increasingly embrace it, and they would feature concerts, important concerts that helped introduce New York audiences to folk music, from spirituals to swing, for example, in 1938 at Carnegie Hall, which was produced by John Hammond. He was a producer, a writer, a civil rights activist, would become known later on for signing Bob Dylan to a Columbia Records contract in 1961, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. He recognized the importance, again, of African American cultural contributions and assembled this concert, from spirituals to swing, an evening of American Negro music in 1938, presenting various genres, musical styles, gospel, blues, New Orleans jazz, boogie-woogie piano, swing music, bringing outstanding musicians like the blues harmonica player Sonny Terry from North Carolina to New York to perform. So really illustrated the rich history of black music, helping to combat racist stereotypes about the impoverishment of African American culture. Big Bill Brunzi, brought in from Chicago, a blues singer. So we're seeing the connection between the left and vernacular music and culture at important institutions like Carnegie Hall in front of interracial audiences. Just like 1940, the Grapes of Wrath fundraiser concert. So New York, a site for progressive concerts for progressive causes, in this case for displaced farmers uprooted by the Dust Bowl in the mid-30s, after the Steinbeck novel, the John Ford film, which had just come out. And look at the lineup there. Can you see who performed at the Grapes of Wrath concert in March 3rd, 1940? Will Geer. He was the one who encouraged Woody Guthrie to come to New York City from California, and actor and activist Alan Lomax, we said, the great folklorist, Aunt Molly Jackson, and union activist and folk singer from Kentucky, who was really the voice of Appalachian labor. She basically faced threats in the early 30s for her activism in Harlan County, Kentucky. Leadbelly Woody, and so on. Not listed there as Pete Seeger. This was Pete's first official concert. And I think what's important here, not just the cause, not just the assembly of talent, but this was the first time that Pete Seeger met Woody Guthrie. It was at the Grapes of Wrath concert in March 1940. Woody really stole the show that night. He was charismatic. He was doing his wry monologues of oaky wisdom in between songs. Pete was a bit nervous and sang a couple of murder ballads and didn't do well, and by his own admission got some polite applause, but was just really astonished at Woody Guthrie. And they had such different personalities, but they became close friends, collaborators. And Alan Lomax later reflected, you can date the renaissance of American folk song to that Grapes of Wrath concert in March 1940 when Pete met Woody. So the real two titanic figures of the folk revival coming together for the first time in March 1940. And they would both play together for this group, the first modern urban folk group, the Almanac Singers, formed in 1941. Again, they embody the connection between leftist politics and folk music, a loose collective based in Greenwich Village. They lived communally in a loft. They represented different racial, class, ethnic backgrounds. People performed for the Almanac Singers and left. It was, again, quite casual and informal, but the core included Pete Seeger in the center, you see with the banjo. From left to right, Woody Guthrie, Miller Lampell, Bess Lomax Hawes. Bess Lomax Hawes was the sister of Alan Lomax, Arthur Stern, and then Sis Cunningham from Oklahoma. And they were unabashedly left in their politics. They were anti-fascist in the early 40s, very pro-Soviet Union. They were pro-labor, as you would guess. And their music, above all, they wanted to start a singing union movement. Again, that was the goal, is to connect with workers, to start a singing union movement. And by their own admission, they failed in this lofty objective, but they did introduce folk music and wrote a lot of their own material, released a couple of albums that didn't sell well. And I do want to emphasize that folk music at this time is really on the commercial margins. When you think of popular singers in the 30s, think of like Bing Crosby, crooners like that. So this is music on the commercial margins. It's not reaching a wide audience, mostly New York intellectuals on the left, middle class, predominantly Jewish, I would say, at this time. Some of at the first album of the Almanac Singers, Songs for John Doe, of course, the common man. You can see like a farmer musician represents the common man on the album cover, two workers in the center. Maybe you can't see, one is a white man, one is a black man walking together in 1941, so that's a real statement in its own right. It was released May in 1941, and remember, global politics at this time, the Soviet Union was still an ally of Nazi Germany, right? And so their music reflected the politics of the Soviet Union, which was anti-war at the time, right? They were critical of the peacetime draft in the United States of President Roosevelt, but what's going to happen in June 1941? Well, of course, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, so oops, we have to pull this album out because now we're going to be pro-war as the Red Army mobilizes, defends itself from the Nazi invasion. So interesting how their songs kind of really reflected the global politics of the time. So on the one hand, they're somewhat cosmopolitan, but they're also provincial as well in other ways. Talking Union, one of their better known songs, they introduced this at a rally of some 20,000 striking transit workers on May Day 1941 in Madison Square Garden. So songs are very explicit in their content. There's no subtlety in their lyrics. They would disband ultimately by around 1943. Some of them were drafted, others worked in the war industry in Detroit. But again, a pivotal band, the first urban modern folk group, the Almanac Singers. After World War II in New York, we see an expansion of folk music culture with the formation, in particular, of the Weavers. They came together in 1948, from left to right, Ronnie Gilbert, Pete Seeger, Lee Hayes, and Fred Hellerman. Lee and Pete were both in the Almanac Singers, so they had long experience performing together. A quartet, again, initially very reluctant to play in nightclubs. They considered themselves to be respectful practitioners of folk music. They didn't want to play in these swank nightclubs because that would have meant maybe polishing the music too much. They did not want to alter the arrangements, the lyrics, the melodic arrangements and so on, just to become popular. They were respectful, wanted to maintain their integrity, but ultimately they overcame that resistance. They said, look, if we continue along thinking in this way, we'll just simply become irrelevant and obsolete. So they compromised and they wore this particular attire that you had to wear, playing these nightclubs like Cafe Society in Greenwich Village in 1951, formal attire, and really enjoyed astonishing success playing at places in New York like the Village Vanguard, getting rave reviews from the press. They would become popular enough to play at Town Hall in Midtown Manhattan. They were managed by Harold Leventhal, a savvy manager, part of the New York folk scene. Like Pete Seeger, he was once a member of the Young Communist League. He had been a promoter of the songs of Irving Berlin, progressive in his values, a veteran of labor battles in the 1930s. So Harold Leventhal will manage them, promote them at places like Town Hall, and they would really, again, enjoy spectacular success. They signed a contract with Decca Records, and this is a premier label. In New York City, since the mid-1930s, with national appeal, Decca Records, some Decca artists included Josh White, Burl Ives, major performers. They were signed by the band leader Gordon Jenkins, who was the staff musical director for Decca Records. He saw them at a Vanguard show, was really smitten, signed them. He had experience working with Frank Sinatra, with the Andrews Sisters, with Louis Armstrong. So again, they're really assembling these professional, savvy individuals to promote them, to manage them, to sign them to Decca Records. And they took Leadbelly's song that they learned from Leadbelly, Goodnight Irene, and made it a smash hit in 1950. Leadbelly had died in 1949, sadly, Lou Gehrig's disease, and his song Goodnight Irene would become a #1 hit. You couldn't turn on the radio in 1950 without hearing Goodnight Irene. They also sang other songs. They enjoyed hits with the Israeli soldier song Tzena Tzena, on top of Old Smoky, a traditional 19th century song with Decca. But playing in swank nightclubs all over the nation, on a tour in Hollywood, Los Angeles, Reno, Houston, making folk music popular and demonstrating the potential for commercial success. So again, prior to this, maybe in the 40s, people like Josh White had a good degree of success, but now we're getting a national audience with the Weavers. So, cultural entrepreneurs are quite savvy and aware of this. So the Weavers would become a model for other groups later on in the late 50s. But before we get to that, they were also victims of the Red Scare, which of course is dominant in American political culture in the late 1940s, early 1950s. This paranoia about subversive activity in the United States will lead to the temporary demise of the Weavers by 1952, 1953. Important is this publication of this tract, this right-wing tract called Red Channels, and again, 1950, the report of communist influence in radio and television. So there was particular concern about people in the entertainment industry. Remember the Hollywood 10? Because if you're a screenwriter, if you're on radio and television, you can influence the ideas, the ideology of the people in the audience, the crowds in the audience, as if crowds of people were passive and easily manipulated. That was sort of the idea. So there was this real, entertainers in particular were indeed targeted during the Red Scare. In this tract, Pete Seeger was listed 13 times for his, quote, subversive activity. He was indeed a member of the Communist Party in the 1940s, and this is going to lead to the quick fall of the Weavers. Decca terminated their contract, they lost radio play, concerts were canceled. They would reunite to great fanfare in 1955 and played this important Carnegie Hall concert, signed with Vanguard Records. But again, I think their success, again, is interesting because it shows the possibility, kind of mirrors the fluidity in the music industry and pop culture, but it also reflects the anxiety in American politics in the early 1950s. And Pete, again, was the Red Scare really trailed him well into the 1960s. He refused to testify about his political affiliations in front of HUAC in 1955. He did not plead the Fifth Amendment, but he pled the First Amendment, said, "This is my freedom of political beliefs, freedom of speech." In 1957, he was indicted. In 61, he was convicted. In 62, that conviction was overturned upon appeal. But again, it wasn't just Pete Seeger whose career was derailed. Others, Josh White, Paul Robeson, Earl Robinson, Alan Lomax, Oscar Brand, Richard Dyer Bennett, were all affected significantly by the Red Scare in the early 1950s. I think some people, the traditional interpretation as well, so folk music is going to really decline then in the early to mid-50s before the revival would take place in 58. I don't present it that way in the book. I challenge that interpretation, and I do that by looking at this the flourishing of new record labels in the city in the late 40s and early 50s, companies, above all, Folkways Records, important here. Folkways Records started in 1948 by Mo Ash, who had experience with other companies. He started Ash Records in 1940, which became Ash Stinson, later Disc, but Folkways would become prominent in the music industry, although not in terms of commercial sales, but significant for cultural and musical reasons. Mo Ash, son of the Yiddish novelist Shalom Ash, family friends with Albert Einstein. And Einstein encouraged him, actually, said, you know, your interest is so eclectic, so inclusive and Catholic, you should record the sounds of the world. And I think that really struck Mo Ash in Folkways. So he made it his mission to document and record the sounds of the world. He was, again, very anthropological, did not look at music in a hierarchical way, wasn't interested in releasing hit albums, hit songs, or anything like that. But he was more interested in recording and disseminating the musical expression of not just Americans and Europeans, but people from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which is why I have this bulletin here, the music of Yugoslavia, Honduras, and Haiti in the early 1950s. So this is really astonishing. Even before we had the term world music, Mo Ash was in fact, producing and distributing world music. Again, not interested in mass culture. He thought that mass culture transformed art, made it homogeneous, banal, bland, targeting large anonymous audiences. He wanted his music to target particular audiences and to enrich people so that they can understand various traditions. Really, and many others like him in the late 40s and early 50s. Again, the question, why New York? In part, our population of cultural entrepreneurs, many of them were Eastern European, Jewish in background. They blended their progressive political values with their entrepreneurial skills, founded these record companies like Maynard and Seymour Solomon at Vanguard, Jack Holtzman at Elektra Records, Oren Keeknews at Riverside, starting venues like Art de Lugoff at the Village Gate, Harold Leventhal as a manager, Albert Grossman, Robert Shelton, the New York Times columnist, all of Jewish in background, and all kind of reflect this descent that was typical of Jewish culture in New York. Not to imply that they were homogeneous and a unified group. They weren't monolithic. In fact, they had these contentious arguments among them, which were really spirited. This is an important trend also happening during this time of the Red Scare, these formation of record companies to disseminate music. Again, on the margins commercially, they're not making much money. Some years they're just struggling to break even, these burgeoning record companies. And I should just pause before I talk about Sing Out. I think this is part, in a broader context, New York culture after World War II. New York becomes the artistic capital of the world, really, supplanting Paris, had been devastated by World War II. And, New York publishing and radio, journalism and television, painting and jazz, dance and theater, all of these arts are fermenting in the late 40s and early 1950s. New York becoming a magnet for performers, for artists coming to the city from all over the nation. And folk music is really much part of this heady brew in New York at the time. Also, another key New York institution that also embodies that connection between leftist politics and folk music was Sing Out magazine. Just got a really good review in Sing Out magazine a couple of weeks ago, so I was happy about that. They started in 1950 by Alan Lomax, Irwin Silber, Pete Seeger, and again, I write the fusion of music and activism. And here's one slide where I present the quotation, and those of you in the back who might not be able to read it, by Irwin Silber about Sing Out magazine and his philosophy in general. The political folk song belongs to all of us. And maybe if more of us exercised our rights in using it and developing it, we would be helping to make America a better place to live. And it really kind of gives a window into the attitude, the ideas of the New York folk community, as diverse as it was and varied as it was. I think this notion that folk music can transform. It can raise your awareness about social and political matters. It can bring people together. It has a communal effect. It could, people come together and can develop social relationships, political relationships around folk music. And there's this faith in it, which, maybe we don't have that in music as much anymore. I mean, we all enjoy music, I'm sure, for different reasons. But to transform society, I mean, wow. But that's, I think, was a guiding principle for Irwin Silber, again, very much on the left in his politics. And Sing Out magazine would really help stimulate important debates about the role of music and culture. He was very much a contrarian, too. He was critical of the Weavers, for example, for playing the songs of Black Americans, but not having a Black member in the quartet. So he very much enjoyed stimulating provocative debate, took Dylan on when Dylan abandoned political music in the mid-60s. So really a very dynamic, provocative individual. Also, Izzy Young, again, another cultural entrepreneur, started the Folklore Center on McDougal Street in the heart of Greenwich Village in 1957. The first really major folk music shop, store in the United States. Sold books, records, instruments. He wrote a column in Sing Out magazine, but more than just selling items, the Folklore Center was a focal point. It was a place for you to go. You just arrived in New York, go down to the village and meet Izzy. He'll introduce you to somebody. He'll help you get a gig somewhere. He's got ideas. He knows people behind the scenes. He's savvy. He's charismatic. He was also outlandish. He's still alive. Still is outlandish, but lovable and often obnoxious too. Izzy's a friend. He's based in Stockholm, Sweden right now. So the Folklore Center, just really a place to rendezvous. You read the memoirs of folk singers, Dylan, Dave Van Ronk, Judy Collins. They all pay tribute to Izzy, to the Folklore Center and what it represented and what Izzy meant, a critical figure on the scene. Scenes like this were common at the Folklore Center in the back room, just folk singers playing casually, Dave Van Ronk, Bob Yellen, Roy Berkeley. This is pretty typical. Sometimes Izzy would close the store early and say, let's just have sort of an informal hootenanny in the back room. This kind of was the spirit of the place. And now we're in the late 1950s, at the peak, just on the cusp of this boom, this commercial boom, which is the focus of the book, as it was in the exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York. And I think you have to ask the question, well, why did folk music really resonate with a nationwide audience in the late 1950s? It did in the early 50s with the Weavers, but now it's really become significant. Some people identify the Kingston Trio song, Tom Dooley, as a song that really ignited the interest. And yeah, that was an important song for sure, but not just cities, not just New York, but many cities had vibrant folk scenes. Boston, Cambridge, Minneapolis, Denver, Chicago, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles, college towns like Oberlin, Berkeley. They all had great folk music scenes. Again, of course, New York was the epicenter of it all. And I think for a couple of reasons. One, what were some of the alternatives in mass culture in the 1950s? I'm a little playful here, but I think there was this widespread sense in the late 1950s, and I think some of the criticisms were really unfair too, but that mass culture was just boring, banal, sterile. It wasn't stimulating. It encouraged conformity, and during Eisenhower's America, it was tasteless, it was mindless. By the late 50s, rock and roll seemingly lost direction, it lost its edge. Elvis had joined the army, rock and roll is engulfed by different scandals. Some of the lyrics too in rock and roll, the kind of boy meets girl, goes to the beach, moon in June, baby I love you. It just didn't reflect the realities of people's lives, getting up in the morning and putting your trousers on and going to work. It just, there was no depth of meaning in this music, whereas folk music, commenting about social, political matters, also has an edge associated with leftist politics. After all, Pete Seeger is a convicted felon, Leadbelly, had been in jail, Woody Guthrie's this rootless Dust Bowl troubadour, so there's an edge to it that's appealing to people who are also reading the beat poets like Ginsberg and the novelist Jack Kerouac. I think liberal, middle-class young adults at the end of Eisenhower era, the beginning of the Kennedy era, gravitating to folk music because of this. Also keep in mind the Cold War, the nuclear arms race is really casting a chill in American culture. White-collar employment, corporate culture is expanding, and there's so many sociological commentaries about how you have a decreasing sense of control. You're increasingly anonymous in these corporate environments in the 50s, but you can go to a hootenanny and you can bond with people over folk music. You can sing together. You can meet people easily in the anonymous city. And these songs are about a whole range of topics. I don't want to just exaggerate politics, but songs about work and play and love and death and loss and deprivation, misfortune, a whole gamut of topics. So I think folk music is going to really resonate for many different reasons here. And, in Greenwich Village, of course, is going to become the epicenter of the scene in the late 50s, early 60s. The heart of it, Washington Square Park. This is chapter 3. Yeah, chapter 3. A whole chapter on Washington Square Sunday afternoon scene where you're coming together Sunday afternoons playing with your banjo, your guitar, your fiddle, your auto harp, meeting like-minded people. From the spring to fall when the weather was nice, Washington Square in the heart of the village, belting out these tunes, and not just singing songs too, but again, it's a bit of a social event. Maybe you can meet a dating partner down there. One place in the city where you feel connected. You feel that connectivity in Washington Square Park rather easy to meet people. You let your guard down. So I think for so many different reasons, you would see interracial couples there in the early 60s. I mean, how many places in the United States, public spaces, did you see interracial couples? An increasing number of gays and lesbians too, taking part in the scene. The scene it's almost like the budding counterculture by the early 1960s. Different arts movements in the village, people hanging out in the park, these bohemians, so-called beatniks with beards, cool, hanging out in the park, and the crowds are really swelling in Washington Square after 1958. And why was that? Does anybody know what happened in 58, 59 that had a big deal in Washington Square concerning urban planning and Robert Moses? That he wanted to expand Fifth Avenue through Washington Square Park, and villagers protested that plan. They said, "Are you insane? This would just destroy the integrity of Washington Square Park if you build a 4-lane road through the park." And they battled against Moses for years and ultimately won. And they closed the park to automobile traffic, and so an enclosed park took on additional integrity and made it more receptive to people coming down to Washington Square Sunday afternoon. So the crowds were swelling. We were seeing the budding counterculture there. And not everybody welcomed this, mind you. Particularly the Parks Commissioner Newbold Morris, who succeeded Robert Moses in 1960, thought that many people were degenerates, in fact, coming down to the village, and they weren't from the neighborhood, and people in the neighborhood wanted to enjoy the park. They worked there 6 days a week after all. On Sunday after church they want to go and relax, and they have to contend with beatniks. So there was a real cultural tension, cultural conflict, and the Parks Commissioner kind of represented the elite attitude towards the arts. Newbold Morris, he was prominent on Lincoln Center, which was newly established in the West 60s. So his notion of art was classical music, the fine arts, symphonic orchestra, not folk music. So guess what? And by the way, you needed a permit to play folk music on Sunday afternoon that you would get from the Parks Commissioner. Going to stop giving out that permit in April 1961. And the folk singers, well, they can go play somewhere else. Well, guess what? The folk singers protested the ban in April 61. The first day of the ban was April 9th, 1961, and there was a clash between folk singers and their allies and the police. The tabloids in New York called it a riot, but it was hardly a riot. There was scuffling, fighting, pushing and shoving, kicking, but a riot? No. A couple people were arrested, and these protests continued for 6 weeks. There was a right to sing committee formed to protest the ban, and these protests were often very colorful. There was some tongue-in-cheek protest too, and the press loved it. The New York media gobbled this up on Sunday, made the front page of papers on Monday. Ultimately, Mayor Robert Wagner realized the ban is ridiculous, let folk singers back into the park 6 weeks later in the middle of May 1961. And Wagner was savvy too, running for re-election. He realized that this would hurt him, having villagers against him. So I think he was very political in his decision to repeal the ban. But an interesting episode that deals not with just folk music, but what's appropriate and inappropriate for public space. And it also really gives us a sense of this cultural tension budding in the 60s between the budding counterculture and traditional families in the South Village, and also elite patricians on Lower Fifth Avenue. Why did folk music flourish in Greenwich Village in the early 60s? I've got a map here, a partial map. Again, the center is Washington Square Park, and all the dots represent on McDougal Street and Bleecker Street and some of the other side streets performance venues. And so this is really critical, again, to answer the question, why New York? Because of all the opportunities that you got to play in New York. All of these venues, dozens of them, this concentration of venues, almost one next door to the other, really remarkable. Were all venues equal in terms of their prominence? No. You really wanted to play, if you're a talented folk singer, at the Bitter End, at Gertie's Folk City, at the Gaslight Cafe, at the Village Gate. But the others are important too. Obviously you want to develop your skills, and you can do them at the smaller venues. And these aren't, I argue in the book, I do devote one chapter to venues, not just places to play, not just physical venues, but places to hone your skills, places to experiment with new material, places to make mistakes in front of sympathetic yet discerning audiences. Maybe you could encounter an agent or a manager in the audience, someone like Albert Grossman or Harold Leventhal. Maybe if you're really lucky, like Bob Dylan or Eric Anderson, Robert Shelton of the New York Times would give you a rave review, and that would really catapult you to prominence, maybe help you get a record contract and land you other gigs. You can gain a following at these venues. You can learn how to hold a crowd's attention. You could even develop, in some cases, a special association with the venue, like, for example, the Bitter End. Who's associated with the Bitter End in particular? Their early album with the brick wall in the back was Peter, Paul, and Mary. So they would often return to the Bitter End even after they gained national prominence, because they had that special personal connection. And this is village culture, and it's not just folk music either. A lot of these venues, these are places, when I'm dealing now with my second book, other artistic movements flourishing there too, off-Broadway, independent film, literature with beat poetry, postmodern dance, a whole array of performance arts. So what do we have here? This is do-it-yourself artistic culture. This is small in scale. It's very much the antithesis of mass culture. In the village, you could bring your guitar down to Washington Square Park on Sunday afternoon and practice finger picking. You could write a song and publish it in Broadside magazine, compose a poem and read it at the Gaslight Cafe, produce a play and stage it at Cafe Manzini, start a fanzine and circulate it at the Folklore Center, create a happening and perform it at Judson Memorial Church, direct a film and screen it at the Bleecker Street Cinema, choreograph a dance and stage it at the Living Theater. So all of this, the overhead was minimal. Artists did not have to gain the approval of donors. So now you have a license to be bold in your method, in your content. So again, this experimental milieu, which I think we're lacking in New York City today, with a few exceptions, but nothing so concentrated like it was in Greenwich Village at this time. So not surprisingly, we're having this influx of artists coming to the village from all over the country. Eric Anderson, come from the West Coast, though he was originally from the East Coast. Judy Collins from Colorado. Mark Spolstra from California. Tom Paxton from Oklahoma. Len Chandler, Phil Oakes from Ohio. Carolyn Hester from Texas. Patrick Skye from Georgia. This influx of this incredible talent. Well, who's that guy from Minnesota? Oh yeah, Bob Dylan. He would come too. So, it was just really a remarkable, this was a rejection of prepackaged entertainment. The village culture encouraged participation in the arts, whereas mass culture encouraged consumption of products. So that's a real distinction here, what made Greenwich Village distinct. These venues like the Gaslight Cafe, where comedy was performed, Gertie's Folk City by Mike Porco, was an Italian restaurant, also a folk music venue. Bitter End on Bleecker Street, still there, right? Of course, the facade is different. Cafe Wa, also still there on McDougal Street. All of these important nurturing venues. Other nurturing institutions in the city, in the folk music scene, Broadside Magazine, started by Sis Cunningham and Gordon Friesen, very much on the left in their politics. And what's important here, this is nurturing the new singer-songwriter movement happening in the early 1960s. The singer-songwriter movement, because I think it's fair to say, by and large, many folk singers had been interpreting traditional ballads. So you go back and listen to the Library of Congress field recordings and you perform your own rendition of it, maybe in a respectful way, in a different way, but now write your own music. But of course it's hard to publish it and circulate it. So here we have, though, a new magazine, a mimeographed magazine, again, part of this do-it-yourself culture called Broadside Magazine, which would be an outlet for this new generation of singer-songwriters to publish their topical songs, and they were very political, many of these songs. Phil Oakes, right? I mean, he was the great political activist, the singing journalist, one of the most political folk singers of the day, right? And published widely in Broadside, Talking Cuban Crisis, Ballad of Oxford, Mississippi, about a civil rights conflict in Oxford, Mississippi at Ole Miss. So Phil Oakes, he would read the newspaper, read Time Magazine, Newsweek, get his ideas, and then write these very topical songs, kind of the moment. And he found a real outlet at Broadside Magazine, as did so many others. Dylan published widely in Broadside Magazine before his songs were released on Columbia Records. So Agnes, Sis Cunningham, Gordon Friesen very much encouraged this young group of singers to submit their work, and they would circulate the songs, and sometimes it helped these young artists get contracts. Also, again, I do want to emphasize the connection between the civil rights movement and folk music. I do this in chapter 5 of the book. Also with pacifism, before the anti-war movement after Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, '64, there was much protest against the military-industrial complex, like Dylan's Masters of War, a great song that protested that. And Talking Cuban Crisis, American Cold War policy. So there's a real deep connection, especially civil rights, right? Folkways Records by Mo Ash released civil rights albums. Mo Ash worked very closely with Guy Carawan, who helped teach SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the song We Shall Overcome. Of course, that became the anthem of the civil rights movement. you can't imagine the civil rights movement without folk music, not just We Shall Overcome, but This Little Light of Mine, We Shall Not Be Moved, so many others, right? Part of African American community traditions, spiritual traditions to sing songs together. So incorporating folk music into the movement wasn't a far leap. It had been part of their traditions already, and really nurtured by these New York institutions like Folkways Records and Broadside Magazine, and Sing Out Magazine, very much in support of the civil rights movement. And many folk singers indeed went down to the South to help in voter registration campaigns in 1963 and 1964 in Mississippi and other places. Folk music is really enjoying widespread popularity at this time, and to the point it really peaked in 1963, 1964, this hootenanny craze. What does the word hootenanny mean? Well, Pete Seeger said he first heard it around 1940 at a CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, meeting out in Seattle, referring to these singing parties to help raise money, and the almanac singers had these hootenannies to help raise rent money for their loft in the village. So it has these origins, kind of an informal, casual sing-along, almost like an open mic today. But now, well, mass culture, pop culture, corporate culture, Madison Avenue will embrace the term, co-opt it, and use it to market products. And so there's a real hootenanny craze of around 1963-64 when folk music reached its peak in popularity. And you can imagine this really stimulated debates and resentment that now we've got all these groups who are just seeking to capitalize on the popularity of folk music. They're not truly authentic folk singers. Groups that faced harsh criticism from purists, so-called purist groups like the Chad Mitchell Trio, the Limelighters, Brothers Four, the Kingston Trio, because of their slick appearance, their commercial popularity, their polished arrangements. They're not really respectful of the traditional folk song. And the left, the political left, of course, was furious. They're taking the people's music and corrupting it. And so all of this debate about who's authentic, who has the right to sing this music, and what does it mean to be authentic? And it really was a slippery term, but it mattered greatly. People debated it just like people debated in hip-hop in the 1990s about keeping it real and who was really authentic in the hip-hop community and who was just simply exploiting the trend for personal reasons. Authenticity might have involved your purpose, your personal style, your stage performance, the lyrical content of your music, sometimes even your regional background, where you were from. Well, Mississippi John Hurt, he's authentic. He's from the Mississippi Delta. It really embodies these. He's organically connected to the culture, and he's representative of it. Sometimes your class background, your racial background, all played into this authenticity debate. It also meant, I think, being respectful and sincere. You could be a, quote, city Billy, but perform folk music in a respectful way like the New Lost City Ramblers did, the Greenbrier Boys, Dave Van Ronk. We're all from northeastern cities, urban or suburban areas, so they weren't from the Piedmont region or the Delta, but they were respectful, so they had more respect in the community than groups like Brothers Four, for example.
What kind of guitar is that?
Oh, I don't even know. Yeah, this is from a Hollywood film in 1963, Hootenanny Hoot. So you can see it's all polished and it's silly, it's tongue-in-cheek, and it's very slick, and it's excessive. So Hollywood is really capitalizing on the trend, and Hootenanny everything. You can get your Hootenanny Halloween costume, your Hootenanny beach bag, Hootenanny hand lotion. I had all of this in the exhibition. I didn't have a Hootenanny pinball machine, but I wanted one. There was a Hootenanny, all this kind of Miss Hootenanny contests, all of this kind of stuff. So packaging folk music. But this craze, this fad, if you will, lasted only about a year or so. Why? What happened in 1964 to...
Fifth Avenue went one way.
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, that's a good one. I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking four lads from Liverpool arrived in New York, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and the British invasion commenced. So now we're more attracted to rock and roll, the British invasion, the Beatles, the Stones, and later on Zeppelin and the Kinks. And so folk music, the hootenanny craze will decline, and indeed, folk music will decline in commercial sales, in popularity, by 65 or so. And we're going to see a whole new emergence of different traditions, folk rock, right? And I heard we were playing songs before we started to talk. The Lovin' Spoonful, the Mamas and the Papas, the Byrds, led by Roger McGuinn. All of these groups are incorporating elements of folk music and rock and roll into this hybrid folk rock, which is really sweeping the nation by 65, 66, 67. And, the greatest singer-songwriter to come out of the Village in the early 60s, of course, is going to go electric. Going to go electric at the Newport Folk Festival, the preeminent folk festival in the nation in Newport, Rhode Island. And Bob Dylan in 1965 on stage, backed by other musicians from Paul Butterfield Band, playing his electric guitar. And yes, it caused a firestorm. Though I think there were more cheers. I'm convinced there's this new book by Elijah Wald about this very subject, and he convinces me that there were more cheers than boos, and some of the boos were a result of the poor sound system. So it wasn't just outrage that Dylan, the spokesman of a generation, is playing the electric guitar and betraying us by no longer playing the acoustic guitar, by no longer playing political music, going away from Blown in the Wind, The Times They Are A-Changing, to more introspective songs like Mr. Tambourine Man. Other songs on his album Bringing It All Back Home, which had come out a few months before this, which was semi-electric. Half the songs were electric, half were acoustic. But I conclude the book, I do have a conclusion, an epilogue post-65, but I see the mid-60s as a real decisive turning point in my narrative, in the exhibition as well, because of these changes that are occurring in the folk music community. Indeed, I should stress, folk music, of course, continued to remain vibrant. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was an ethnic folk music revival in the city where different ethnic groups, especially in the outer boroughs, were looking back at their own cultural traditions. Eastern European Jews, klezmer music became prominent in the 70s and 80s in certain communities. Irish Celtic music performed in taverns. The Cherish the Ladies, this Irish celebration of traditional Celtic music, which was in part stimulated by the Clancy brothers from the late 50s, but it really took off in the 70s and 80s. And that was one of the principles of the folk music revival, to investigate your personal family history, your cultural, ethnic history, your heritage, embrace your music, your traditional songs, your cooking, your dance, your language, your religion, and understand the importance of it as part of your identity on a personal level, on a broader communal level. So we see that, I think, in the 70s and 80s, and then there are other movements in the 90s, like fast folk in the 80s and 90s, and even today, right, we have folk music venues in the city like Jalopy Theater in Red Hook, Brooklyn, Pete's Candy Store partly in Williamsburg, sometimes performs folk music there, the Living Room, so on, and the Brooklyn Folk Festival is an annual event. So, but it's much more on the margins now than it was during its heyday in the late 50s to the mid 60s. So I will end there.